It's now time for The Journal, WBGU-TV's award-winning public affairs program, with your host, Steve Kendall. This is where your community matters. Local people, local issues.
Hello and welcome to The Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. BGSU's Center for Regional Development recently held its State of the Region event, and joining us to talk about that is the center's director, Russell Mills. I want to thank you for being here today. We're going to talk about that event, which happened just a few weeks ago, but also too we'll talk about some of the other things the center's involved in. But let's talk about the focus on that, because the actual title was Connected with the World: Global Trade, Investment, Logistics, Supply Chains, and Their Impact on Economic Development in Northwest Ohio. Just kind of a nice short thing. And the guests you had there were focused on that sort of thing. But let's talk about that event and the state of the region based on some of the things that were talked about that day.
Sure. So we this year's State of the Region conference looked at the role that foreign companies and foreign employment play in Northwest Ohio. We sort of think it's one of the under-discussed impacts that these companies have in Northwest Ohio. Right. You know, we recently did an economic impact analysis of these businesses in Northwest Ohio, sort of as a precursor to the event.
Right.
Found that 1 in 10 jobs and over half of the region's economic output, are tied to these foreign companies, right? And some of the large ones, Fiat Chrysler, some of those big names that we have in the region really do help generate significant economic impacts and employment across the 17-county region.
Yeah. Well, and we were down a few weeks ago in Wapakoneta, and they were developing an industrial park down there, and the companies were from Australia, France, Great Britain, and I want to say like New Zealand or something.
Yeah.
So it was mainly foreign. I mean, there were some U.S. companies there, but a lot of the attraction was to foreign companies.
Yeah, and our region's very good for, if you're looking for a place to set up shop in the United States, if you're particularly a foreign manufacturer or a company that's in trade and logistics, Northwest Ohio is a great location, right? You're within a day's drive. What do they always say? 75% of the U.S. population, right? We have intersection of 80 and 90 and 75. So from a distribution perspective, if you're going to set up shop in the United States, this region makes a lot of sense. I also would highlight the role that our air transportation for a lot of these foreign companies. The proximity to Detroit Metro that we have here is a very big thing for them to maximize their time getting back and forth. So Northwest Ohio is very attractive to a lot of foreign companies, and frankly, we do a good job through the Regional Growth Partnership and Paul Zito, who's the VP for International Development, in promoting Northwest Ohio to those companies.
Yeah. Now, and the Toledo Metropolitan Area Council of Governments also has a little bit. They're involved in this as well. But you mentioned airports, and of course, Toledo has Express Airport, and they've for years tried to enhance that, make it a bigger player. Is it difficult for an airport that's in that close proximity to a major airport like Detroit to ever be a player in that, or not?
Yeah, I think Toledo Express has done a great job of actually getting connectivity to hub airports again in the U.S. So the flight to Charlotte's done really well. It's been a big get for the region, I would say. It has a $15.4 million economic impact annually, so it's generating a lot of connectivity, particularly for our business community. Several of our big companies, OI, Owens Corning, have a lot of connections in Charlotte. So that makes
perfect for them.
Makes it good for them. But I think having options, right? I mean, if you're an executive from overseas, right, you can go to Detroit, or you can take one stop through Chicago or Charlotte and get to your destination if you're an American Airlines flyer rather than a Delta flyer.
Sure.
So I think having as much connectivity through Toledo Express, plus all the vacation tourism,
traffic,
on Allegiant and those flights. So I think they're doing a great job. The industry is very tough, and we could do a whole segment on air service.
On the competition, air service, and then of course then down the other end, down at the southern part of Wood County. Has rail sort of, it seems to ebb and flow. You hear great things about rail sometimes, and other times, well, it's not what people want. I mean, that's another one of those sort of highly competitive, tends to go up and down a little bit, at least from the outside looking in anyway.
Sure. I mean, I think the CSX project in North Baltimore has been one that has mixed results. I think initially it was done well, but I think the rail industry's changed in terms of what they want to do with that facility, whether it's going to be an intermodal facility or whether it's just going to be one big connection point for their rail. So I think CSX is still trying to figure that out, and and I think that the economic development community is also trying to figure out what that looks like in the future and what the opportunities are. So I think there will be news on that, somewhere down the line. Again, it depends on what CSX decides it wants to do from a logistics perspective with their operation.
Yeah. Now, when you talked about the keynote speaker, talk a little about what the focus was there with that particular person.
So we had two who I would say keynote speakers. So one, we had the Consul General of Canada for Detroit, Joe Comart, and he sort of discussed the recent tariffs enacted by the United States, and he frankly didn't pull any punches. He said, you usually don't call your friends sort of a national security threat, which is what the tariffs are implemented under the pretext of that. So so he was very very straightforward about the impacts of those. And then our second keynote was Pam Heminger from, she's the Vice President of Business Operations from Honda of North America. She discussed the attractiveness of Ohio for why they would set up operations for their facility down in Marysville in Union County. So both of those were discussing sort of the strength of the auto industry, the impact of trade and tariffs on their operations, and how they may play in the future with what they're trying to do. And the Consul General really, again, was really looking at, how the tariffs enacted by the United States will impact the ability of Canada and the U.S. to be trading partners, and frankly the ratification of the new agreement afterwards.
Yeah, now it's an interesting, because Canada has always been, basically one of our best friends. I mean, in all ways, and so it is kind of a speed bump on the highway of our relationship over 100-some years in terms of that kind of that activity, and tied a lot to the auto industry, especially because there's a lot of that crosses the bridge there in Detroit. I'm sure a lot of material going both ways.
Sure. I mean, one of the other things you touched on was the Gordie Howe Bridge that they're
the new one. Yes, the proposed should be eventually, we think, will be built.
It's been proposed for a long time, I guess. But I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? I mean, you can't, trade and tariffs are very complicated beasts always, but particularly in this case, when so much of our automobile industry has been regionalized between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. I mean, there's no such I would argue there's no such thing as an American vehicle anymore. These vehicles all have content, most of them from other countries, components that are from all these different regions of the world. So it's very difficult to just slap these trade barriers on and expect the cost of automobiles not to increase, or there to be some impact on employment. So these things don't happen in isolation anymore. Our cars are global products. They really what an automobile, when you're buying today, is a brand name that's slapped on top of a supply chain. That's really what a car is today.
Which, when we come back, let's talk a little bit, because I'm curious to see whether or not if we had to source a car out of American parts, if we could actually, how difficult or how easily that could be done. So that'll be the question when we come back. Back in just a moment here on The Journal on WBGU TV. Thank you for staying with us here on The Journal. We're talking with the director of the BGSU Center for Regional Development, Russell Mills. We left that last segment. We were talking about tariffs and the way we source vehicles and that sort of thing. If we had to actually source a vehicle out of all American parts, what would that do to the supply chain that we currently have? Because our supply chains build on things coming from all over the world, especially Mexico and Canada. What kind of disruption are we talking? Because supply chain's all about efficient assembly, manufacture, and pricing.
Sure, I'm sure we could assemble a car. I don't know how pretty it would be and how good of a car it would be. I mean, but I think it's important to realize that the new proposed agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico really, or actually just the U.S. and Canada in this case, really has new domestic content requirements for the automobiles. One of the reasons we've seen a lot of foreign direct investment in Northwest Ohio, particularly in the automobile sector, are because of these proposed requirements. And so it's actually been an economic driver for us. Higher if there's a higher domestic parts requirement that has to be in the U.S., then foreign companies that provide those parts will look to set up an operation. And frankly, because we're so close to a lot of these final assembly facilities, Northwest Ohio makes a lot of sense, and we have a history of workers who know how to do these kind of things.
Sort of thing.
So we've been very good at promoting that to many of the parts manufacturers around the world.
Now, the so-called, I mean, the domestic manufacturer, we traditionally think of Ford, General Motors, has there been any indication that they're bringing some of their plants that manufacture parts like that back to this country or not? Or is it more, as you said, foreign companies saying, oh, we're going to build in the U.S. because that way we meet this new requirement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the final assembly facilities for those automobiles, so the Lordstown piece is one we've discussed at length. Sure. I mean, I think what you're seeing are these car companies, what they're trying to do is figure out how to best get around trade agreements by setting up facilities in locations where they can most easily sell their products. So for instance, the Chevy Cruze, okay, that automobile is now popular in Mexico and in Europe. So
but
one
not
of the
as much here, not as much as we'd like in the U.S. or General Motors would like here in the U.S.
Sure, but one of the key things that people don't realize is Mexico has a free trade agreement with Europe. So if you're going to sell Chevy Cruzes, it doesn't make sense to make them in the United States where we don't have a free trade agreement with the Europeans. But if you in Mexico, you can sell them there. So a lot of these things aren't decisions being made by the companies to sort of put it to the American worker. A lot of them are, these governments are enacting trade agreements. Where should we set up our operations where it's the most efficient to ship them to?
And that makes sense. And that kind of tends to get lost in the discussion, though, because anytime you close a manufacturing plant, it's news, generally speaking, and especially with the automotive industry and in the Midwest. But that's a point that hasn't been addressed a lot, that it really was. It isn't just General Motors saying, hey, look, we'd like to manufacture things someplace else because there was a rational business reason for them to say, if this is where our markets are and there's a better agreement between those two countries or those two regions, it makes sense for them to do that versus building in the U.S. and then pushing uphill a little bit through all those other things.
And I would say a lot of the blowback for General Motors is more due to the fact that of the bailout following 2008. And I think that's really where a lot of the angst comes from. Although, if you look, the United States has actually made money following that, given the profitability of General Motors over the years. So, I mean, but that argument resonates with people. We, the U.S. taxpayers, propped up this company. Many people feel that means that they are entitled to employment in this country in perpetuity.
I was just going to say,
And so that makes it a difficult political decision for folks. And frankly, I mean, as we transition to a more automated factory for a lot of these companies, that the employment to output relationship is something that needs to be reconsidered sort of across the board.
Sure. And we've talked about that before, that a facility, if the Lordstown facility example, even at full current production, whatever that would have been, there were a lot fewer people working there 6 months ago than there were 15, 20 years ago, simply because of the way the technology has changed the assembly process and the manufacturing processes.
Yeah, so at the State of the Region, one of the things we also discussed was the role of automation in our region. We are the most automated region in the United States. We have more industrial robots per worker than anywhere else in the U.S. We also have the most jobs at risk for automation. 49% of the jobs in Northwest Ohio are potential for have the potential to be automated. So how we as a region figure out what we should do with that really is going to be a key to our economic success in the future.
Now, where do we stand in the development, manufacture, application in terms of, are we taking advantage of the fact that there's demand for robots? Do we have a foothold there at all in Northwest Ohio?
I think it's our greatest opportunity in the region. So I was actually with some of the folks from the Regional Growth Partnership and Jobs Ohio over at Hanover Messe, which is the world's largest trade fair for robotics and all these things. And we were meeting with some of these large robotics companies like KUKA, who actually has all the robotic technology in the Jeep factory up in Toledo.
Okay.
And they see pretty much an unlimited growth model for as the technology evolves, as there's workforce challenges. One of the key things that people miss on the automation debate is that automation takes place fastest in regions where there are workforce challenges.
Okay.
And so one of the reasons automation's so prevalent here is because A, we have a shrinking population, and B, we have a difficult time getting workers into manufacturing jobs in this region. And so a lot of the automation in our region has been out of business necessity rather than sort of, again, sticking it to the worker. And so trying to figure out how we can produce, repair, innovate technologies for these robotics, setting up that type of infrastructure and ecosystem in our region, I believe is what we should be focused on as a region, not fighting automation, because we're not going.
Because automation well, and if you think about it, I guess probably from the Henry Ford assembly lines days, that to some degree it was sort of a very rough-hewn version of automation. Right. It was a change in the way everything wasn't handmade and each part wasn't manufactured by hand. How did we end up in a situation where our workforce here we don't have the numbers? Is it simply because of population, or what is, or did we misalign someplace with the way we looked at manufacturing and preparing people to work in that industry?
No, I mean, I think it's a generational change. So when you talk to Gen Zers and millennials, a lot of these kids grew up in households where their jobs were outsourced in the 80s through companies in manufacturing. They've seen the effects of automation, and frankly, their parents, I would argue it's just the natural evolution. If your parents worked in manufacturing, their goal for you is not to work in manufacturing, right? I mean, you hear it as a kid, right? I want you to. Your parents always say, "I want you to do better than I did."
Right.
And for a lot of them, that means going to a 4-year institution of higher ed, which doesn't really align well with a career in manufacturing. So I think a lot of it is just we're so concentrated in manufacturing in our region that a lot of the next generation aren't interested in it.
They had a bad taste about it simply because of certain things that happened. Well, and we know too that you always hear people say, gee, don't, son or daughter, don't go into the business I went into, whether it's manufacturing, whatever it is. And then you on top of that, you stack a thing where, well, because we suffered tough times in the 80s, we suffered tough times later in the late aughts, the O's or whatever. That doesn't make people think, let's go there. But now there is somewhat of there's more demand than we can supply, which we would think, gee, that's unfortunate for us.
And now, I mean, we're starting to see sort of the reverse, right? Because now with the student, the media attention around student loan debt, entry-level salaries for folks with a 4-year degree have traditionally been higher, but now because of some of the demand for these jobs in manufacturing, sometimes those salaries can outpace what you would get at a 4-year institution. So a lot of our counties, local economic development offices are focused on making manufacturing an option for students in high school, exposing them to what, and frankly, the modern factory doesn't look anything like the old like the jungle from Upton Sinclair. It's not like not like that anymore, right? So these are very automated, almost futuristic factories that we have in Northwest Ohio.
Okay. Well, we come back. Let's talk a little more about that, and then touch on a couple of other things too. Back in just a moment with more about the Center for Regional Development and the state of our region's economy here on The Journal on WBGU-TV. You're with us here on The Journal on WBGU-TV, and our guest is Russell Mills, the director of Bowling Green State University's Center for Regional Development. Let's talk a little more about workforce, because obviously you hear these stories like, employment is strong, but we still have this gap. How are we going about the fact of convincing younger, this generation of people in high school and heading toward college or coming out of high school to think of manufacturing differently than they've been instructed or been conditioned to over the years?
Yeah, I think the efforts that the counties are making and the career centers are doing are great work. But I would say one of the challenges we have is that we're bringing in more manufacturing jobs in our region than we can supply. Right? I mean, look, the first solar factory, 1,000 jobs. The NSG new glass facility is going to be several hundred jobs.
Right.
Those and now those aren't your run-of-the-mill manufacturing jobs.
Sure,
in a lot of cases.
those are
some
high.
of those are your engineer level type jobs, but some of them are manufacturing jobs. And how do we bring in that mass of people when our region's losing roughly 1.5% of our population each year? That's a difficult thing to do at a large scale. Now, the chamber, the Toledo Region Chamber of Commerce, later this month or later in May is going to have a talent summit, basically, and it'll produce the results of a study that they've been conducting for the last year. We participated in several other organizations looking at how do we better align what we have in terms of jobs to our educational programs in the region, and how do we make those things match better. I think that's a key to this whole thing is, are we producing degrees, students that are trained in the jobs that we have, and the other way around, are we bringing in jobs
that
for which we
match.
have a supply of workers?
Sure.
So I think that's the goal of that, and I think that report will spur a larger regional conversation. The other thing that we're working on at the center is working with several of the counties in our region on a comprehensive economic development strategy for the region. So it's a thing that's done through the Economic Development Administration every year. But part of that is going to be looking at how well do the projects we're going after for companies, business attraction, retention, but also entrepreneurial activities in the region. How well does that align with our workforce, and how do we enhance our workforce? Things that you may not think of that are that really affect workforce, things like public transportation, for instance.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Those kind of things. Right. How well are we doing in the region on that? Are there opportunities for us to be doing better on that? And those are really some of the things we're going to look at.
And I guess when we've talked about this too, when a prospective company looks at locating or relocating into Northwest Ohio, those are the kind of things they have to look at. First of all, they want to know, can you supply me with the workforce that's capable of doing what I want to do? And then there's all those sort of quality of life, logistics. What kind of life am I moving? Well, if I'm going to move a vice president or president here to run something, they want to know, what's the area like? What are the schools like? What's the environment like? What's all of those kind of things. So it isn't just about one particular thing. There's a whole series of things that have to come together there. Are we doing better with that than we have in the past? Are we more together as a region on that?
Yeah, I think we are, and I think we're doing a better job of marketing the Toledo region as a whole. Frankly, the Chamber and the Regional Growth Partnership have really led the way on that, and I think they're doing a better job in marketing Toledo. And one of the things you and I've talked a lot about is I think our region has a glut of the we have a shortage of the 22 to 30-year-old crowd, right? Students graduate. We have a lot we have a lot of college students in the region here, UT. They say, I'm going to go get that first job, frankly, to pay back some student loan debt. So they go to a place where the wages are higher.
Yeah.
If you look around the state, that's Columbus, right? That's where we lose most of our people to. But we also lose a lot of students to Chicago.
Yeah, out of state.
A lot of people, to places where there's high wages. But there's also, I don't think they think this through. There's a lot of high cost of living as well.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, there's that. Yeah.
And so, so if you look at those things, those are where we're losing students to. But then if you look at our population trends over time, we actually do a really good job of higher than average of bringing back people in their 30s to 40s.
Okay.
And I think that really is a factor of I want to start a family. I can't do that here because it's expensive in Columbus, Washington, D.C., wherever. People come back here to start a family because the schools are good. The cost of living is low.
Is reasonably is good, yeah.
And so I think that's what, our we're good on that. The challenge for us is figuring out how to keep those 22 to 30-year-olds.
Not bring them back, but how to keep them here for all.
And again, the Toledo Regional Chamber of Commerce has done a good job on programs like Summer in the City, some of the other internship things that they do to really try and get those folks to stay in our region.
Yeah. Now, when you look at, and a lot of times we talk regional, depending on where you live. I mean, Lucas County tries to do, for instance, as a county, tries to put together things, and they consider that to be sort of regional, but there's a lot of political, a lot of old wounds that haven't healed, old, I don't know how to describe it, but it's difficult to overcome some of those past misdemeanors that have taken place, or the impressions or misconceptions people have. And we haven't, we didn't really talk about this, but water being the one right now that seems to be the most difficult thing to get people on the same page. And although there has been a lot of progress recently, is that kind of thing for a manufacturer, is that as important as it used to be? Because I know that those big industrial users use a lot of water, depending on whatever they're doing. But is that as big a deal as it was 3 or 4 years ago for us, or not?
Sure. I mean, I think it is an issue still. I mean, but if I'm a company looking, one of the benefits of relocating to the United States, if you're a foreign company, is supposedly political stability.
Yeah.
And if at the national level you have what's perceived to be political instability, and then at the regional level there are these fights over these kind of issues, those things make it less attractive for a foreign company to relocate to your region. So I think the water itself is part of the issue, but I think the larger dynamic of these regional disputes are things that we need to fix. And like you said, there's been a lot of progress been made in the last three months or so. I think that's going to continue, but from my perception, what I've seen working in the economic development community, this region is together on a lot of these issues. There still may be these squabbles, frankly, between some of the people who were in power at one time and who aren't anymore,
or want to retain their territorial.
But
power,
among the people that are among the people that are out there now working on economic development and workforce development, people in the region know they have to be together regionally. So so groups like RGP, the Northwest Ohio Regional Economic Development, NORED, those groups are bringing people together all the time. Us through our role as an economic development center, trying to bring people together to make these large scale initiatives work. And I don't see much resistance to that. Most people know that that's the way we're going to get ahead.
That we need to do that, and we have, and it's for the benefit of the region and everybody who lives here, and as you said, to retain, to have people not go away and then come back. Because it's interesting, because they will come back, which speaks to the quality of life and then some of the other issues you talked about. But the trick is not to have them leave to begin with.
No, I mean, we have, like I said, we bring in a lot of people from other places because of the universities. We're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't figure out how to keep them here.
Now we've got just a minute or so. Is there one thing that you guys are looking at in the future? I know that you're part of your business is trying to figure out where we're going to be a year from now or 5 years from now. Is there one thing that you see as the next big development or the big idea that this region has to look at?
Yeah, we sort of touched on it earlier, but I really do think figuring out how to make us the Silicon Valley of robots and manufacturing robots is really the key for this region. How do we align our educational systems? How do we, we obviously have a lot of STEM programs in our region that are really encouraging this. How do we align what UT's doing, what BGSU is doing, with what Penta, with some of the other Northwest State
centers are doing,
the community colleges. How do we align all that to make this an attractive place to go have these conversations with these large-scale innovators in robotics, to bring them here? Because I think if we continue to automate our current factories, which we have a lot of, this is going to be a place that they'll want to be. And how do we make sure we
should be the supplier of all of that automation if we can. Sure. Okay. Well, Dr. Russell Mills from the Center for Regional Development, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
We'll check back again in a few months and see how things are going as well. You can check us out at WBGU.org, and of course you can watch us every week here on the Journal on WBGU TV Public Television. We'll see you again next time.